This'll never not be weird, will it? If you've not watched the season preview video, where we go through all the driver changes, including this one and its subsequent knock-on effects, yeah, you better go back, basically. You better go back and watch that real quick, because, yeah, this is a thing that's happened, and you really ought to be brought up to speed on all those things before getting into this season opener. And as for this season opener, if you've watched the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix and watched the preamble to that one, yeah, you'll know that we've had a bit of an issue with this one. We had a bit of a sound issue, which ironically was about to happen again, and I caught it before I clicked record on this one. This video has already been recorded, and I'm having to re-record it as a post-commentary now due to a catastrophic sound issue, which is frankly unsalvageable. So hopefully you enjoy this slightly different approach to a recording, as I effectively watch my footage back and try to remember what exactly I was doing in any given moment. I remember the outcome, I remember the ending. Stick around. So without further ado, let's get into the actual episode. There's not really that much to discuss about what happened beforehand, because obviously pretty much everything happened beforehand in the season preview video, which brought us all the way up to race day. But just a brief comparison to the fastest car on the grid, which of course is the Red Bulls. The only thing we really did beforehand was just work out which cars were actually still faster than us in those cornering and dirty air cornering sections, which we are pretty potent on. Really, the only cars that are still faster than us overall are the Red Bulls and the Ferraris. So practice was kind of run-of-the-mill. We drove our car a little bit harder and a little bit longer than we would normally in practice 3 in particular, just to try and get as much car knowledge as possible. So neither driver did a sort of a low fuel run. There was always a maximum fuel run, a maximum distance run, regardless of tyre. So practice 3, 8th and 11th, maybe unrepresentative, slightly under our overall performance, but you can see Red Bull's top, Ferrari second, Mercedes effectively behind, but Lewis Hamilton still exists in that Alpine. And apparently Zhou Guanyu could be interesting here, along with Alexander Albon in the AlphaTauri. Jack doing not too far behind as well. McLaren's slipped down, but you can see from here 100% track acclimatization, 87% car knowledge, so nearly there with brand new cars. I do not know why when you do Bahrain testing, car parts are not kind of put at 100% at that point. And then obviously if you change any car points between Bahrain and the first race, then those car parts get reset. But so I do not really know why you start at 0, but you do. Nonetheless, it was enough to get his 15 out of 15 performance bonus, and we're all flying there. So, qualifying, and apologies for obviously the lack of engine noise here, because the engine noise is inherently tied to my tinny voice in the original recording, so we're just using the menu music from the actual game in the background. It's weird. For someone who usually makes Football Manager videos without any kind of musical background or what have you, it feels odd not to have any music in the background of one of these videos at all, so enjoy the F1 Manager menu music. As first round of Q1 gets underway here, Gasly pops in a time that's good enough for 5th. Mick puts the time good enough for 8th, as a few people still yet to cross the line, but only Hamilton is the one that we're expecting to get ahead of us here, or ahead of Mick at least. So 5th and 9th from the first runs, the two Williams. Logan Sargent, of course, in the Williams now, which is interestingly appropriate. The one thing I will say about F1 Manager 22 is there's only 2 rookies full stop after 2 years. Obviously Jack doing in year 2, and now Logan Sargent in year 3 of the game. It's a little disappointing, like the overall turnover here. Obviously, I'm happy to see Daniel Ricciardo still in the seat. I'm happy to see Vettel still in the seat. But yeah, the fact we've only had two rookies in 2 years, the only casualty so far have been Latifi, interestingly, and Fernando Alonso just retiring at the end of his Alpine contract, which I think must have been extended for 1 year. He ran out of contract at the end of season 1 in reality, which is why he went to Aston Martin. So they must have extended his contract for a year in game, and then he retired at the end of that. But trying to get our vehicles out for a good Q1 run here, I believe I leave Gasly in the pits for this one, just because his time is certainly good enough to get through here. Obviously none of the AI are intelligent enough to deal with that. But Mick in 9th, Daniel Ricciardo on the cusp, obviously seeing Sainz and Albon with much more time to really sort of improve on there. Ricciardo too, we're kind of expecting to be much faster. Ocon we're expecting to be faster than Mick, and Norris we're expecting to be faster than Mick, or at least potentially faster than Mick. So Mick in his current 9th spot is not impenetrable. At this stage, we're effectively just expecting the 2 Williamses and the 2 Haas and maybe an Alfa Romeo to be in that bottom 5. We're not certain who effectively is that 5th worst. The Hasses and the Williams were expecting to be in the bottom 4, but as you can see, the game having a wonderful moment here of the Red Bull being stuck right up the back of a Williams. Not that the Red Bulls needed to come out again, of course, anyway, but hilarious if they had been in trouble. as Logan Sargent holds them up on his attempt to not be in the bottom 5. And to be fair, him having to defend from the Red Bulls is probably actually hurting his time, which is a bit of a game issue as people pop in faster times now. Sainz takes his rightful spot at the top of the table. In second, pushes Stroll and Ricciardo into the bottom 5 as Albon also gets out of there. Ocon goes back ahead of the pair of them. Doohan in 9th still. Vettel had already crossed the line along with Doohan, I believe. Oh no, that was Albon actually. That's at the front of that queue. So Vettel had already crossed the line ahead of a full lap's worth. So Stroll's the only one that can get out of the bottom 5 at this point in time and doesn't. I tell a lie, Vettel actually was the last Haas. So Mick 10th at the end of Q1 is a positive sign. It was indeed the 2 Haas's and the 2 Williamses in the bottom 5 along with Lance Stroll in his Alfa Romeo. Zhou Guanyu in qualifying not quite as good as his practice, so maybe that's the relative pace of the Alfa Romeo actually. Of course, in not running Gasly's second time, we have saved a set of soft tyres for him, potentially for the race if we never, get around to using them, which was basically the entire idea there. Gasly obviously not quite there in terms of being immune in Q2s yet, we suspect. So we will have to run our cars twice in Q2, as they do get clean runs on their flying laps for the first round of this. Putting in time, there's only 3/10 worth than Sainz. Everyone using used tyres though, as you can see here. Jack doing the only one not to come out at all, it seems. He does finally come out to do his first run, and so he wasn't just doing the one run after all. But everyone does their first run on used tyres. We flip to our fresh sets. Gasly finds himself in 4th, Mick in 8th. But there are people beneath Mick that we would expect to go faster than him, or potentially faster than him. Russell for certain. The McLarens, Ocon, Albon, Doohan. Quite frankly, it seems like any of them could be faster than Mick. Gasly, however, kind of really only expecting Bottas and Russell and Perez to be faster than him. So we feel like Gasly is probably safe around 7th at worst here. Maybe 8th if Hamilton too joins that group. But obviously we can't risk it even with Gasly. Realistically, if this was a real Q2, only really Verstappen and Sainz would probably feel like they're safe at this stage. It is a 5/6 gap in terms of Leclerc to the cutoff point, so maybe Leclerc might feel safe. And Gasly could really probably feel safe, with a solid half a second on them. But in real life, the track might ramp up a little bit faster and have that little bit more advantage if you go again later on. But that doesn't feature in the game. Neither does the sense of the AI to not come out again. So swings and roundabouts, really. So, of course, in Q2 here on board with Mick's flying lap. And I'll just say here, of course, apologies, of course, this is a recording of a recording. So it may not be quite the fidelity you're used to, but I am prioritizing the quality of the sound over the quality of the video in this particular case, because you would not have lasted 5 seconds with the original sound. Trust me. But as Mick comes round the first sector, both of them do better first sectors, heading towards the tight left-hander that runs onto the back straight. Some of the drivers are just approaching the finish line. Sainz crosses first and sneaks that little bit closer to Verstappen, but doesn't usurp him. The first big shock, though, Albon moves up to 6th, so immediately warning signs for Mick here as Albon goes ahead of him. Russell goes into 4th. There are some big gains from the people behind Mick Schumacher, and this is concerning. Immediately, Norris goes 6th from the bottom 5. Hamilton moves up again. There's movement between the Red Bulls and the Ferraris in the top 4. Bottas returns to P5. Gasly's yet to cross the line as well, of course, here. Ocon's crossed the line in 11th, so that's interesting. Gasly moves up to 3rd, shockingly, and then Mick crosses the line, sadly, in 11th. Ricciardo's slowest of the 15, though, is curious. And Ocon only 13th is also curious. Jack Doohan sneaks 10th. So Mick sadly eliminated in Q2 here, but on the fringes, and technically that means he saves a set of soft tyres for the race, unintentionally, as he doesn't have to run another set again. And based on the pace of everyone else, really, at this point, we're kind of only expecting him to have been faster than Jack Doohan is the only one that's kind of vaguely in his range. So even if he had snuck into that top 10, there's a very good chance he would have just finished. Lando Norris there, as we did the comparisons, gained 3.5 tenths between Q1 and Q2, which is why he snuck up there. He did a 131.5 effectively in the first one, and then a 131.1 to get into Q3. Huge gains from Lando there between Q1 and Q2. But it doesn't mean we've only got Gasly, but obviously we saved him a set of soft tyres at the beginning anyway. Not that we're using them for the first run, we're still using a used set for the first run. We're keeping one entirely fresh set for the race, just in case as Gasly gets stuck on all sorts of traffic on his first round here. But does get a decent toe off Sainz to the actual line, and then promptly, of course, gets in the way of Perez and Norris on the return leg. So whilst he gets held up, he holds them up. But it's not a good time to start with. In 10th, Norris obviously suffering from that, and Perez obviously suffering from that as well. But Jack Doohan comes out first, rightly so, because probably going to lose the toe of anyone else almost. There comes Hamilton in his Alpine. That's so weird. We're just waiting to make sure we don't get a Red Bull or a Ferrari basically behind us, hounding us like they did the Williamses in Q1 here. There's the Ferrari. The Mercs we're kind of okay with. We don't mind being on ahead of the road on a Merc because they're not that much faster than us, or if they are faster than us at all, or Gasly at least. But those Red Bulls and those Ferraris, particularly the Red Bulls, you don't want them behind you when you're doing a qualifying lap still. Even with the improvements to our car, even though we effectively have the third fastest car in the corners at least, we don't want the Red Bulls behind us in particular. You saw at the end of Q2, of course, that we were at least able to mix it with those big boys as Gasly popped in at the time good enough for third. So we're expecting reasonable things here from Gasly. We would like to beat the Mercs, so 5th is a nice spot to be. 7th we'll accept and just hope that he could do better over the course of the race. But 5th is kind of our aim here, just to be behind those Red Bulls and Ferraris, whatever order they end up in. Hamilton, of course, is a bit of a wild card in the Alpine, but just because we do not know how he's going to, with his 91 rating, cope with the Alpine car. Because the Alpine car could be rubbish, quite frankly, but Hamilton could yank it up the order. We don't know how good he is. Ocon qualified 13th, of course. But Hamilton's crossed the line. The first one to actually take the checkered flag, doing cross the line irritatingly ahead of the checker flag, so he has to go all the way around again before we end this session. But Hamilton doesn't improve, stays 7th, Bottas stays 5th, Perez stays 4th, Leclerc stays 2nd, Verstappen stays 1st. Not a lot of improvements from the other drivers at this stage. In fact, I'm pretty certain nobody has actually improved, except maybe Perez back up to 5th. Gasly, however, goes 2nd. And surprisingly, Norris actually didn't improve on 10th, even though he did outqualify Jack Doohan originally. Couldn't find that Q2 lap again. But Gasly will start the Bahrain Grand Prix in P2. So for the start of this Grand Prix, the objectives are Gasly to take the lead and Mick Schumacher to take a top 10 position. But you can see there, Lando returned to his 1:31.5 that he did in Q1, which is fascinating. He can pull together a lap again. But Pierre Gasly, between Q1 and Q2, gained half a second. Charles Leclerc also did a much worse lap than he did in Q2 as well, which is why Gasly usurped him. So for the race, we are gambling on a hard, medium, hard strategy. All the strategies are to stop. This one is theoretically the fastest of all of them, mostly because it used the fastest tyres, of course. But the issue with this strategy, though, is it does run the tyres to 30% every single stint, effectively. So the options to push on our tyres are very, very limited. If we push on the tyres, we're going to have to conserve on the tyres. So at some stage. And you know I don't like to run the tyres much below 40%, let alone this 30 that these are going to be running to. But the other options just aren't as fast. And with Gasly trying to take the lead, we can't really put him on a worse tyre. And with Mick trying to get into that top 10, immediately trying to get some of those slower cars, what we perceive to be slower cars, straight away, I want him on the fastest tyre to start with possible. Of course, we do have another set of mediums, so the option to flip to medium. Medium is there, and the hard still exists if we wanted to go on hards on the middle stint as well. If anything happens early on, we could go on the hards in the middle and back on the softs at the end. For instance, the flexibility of starting with the soft actually is really helpful. Of course, there's no TED to say it's lights out and away we go here, but lights out and away we go. As Max Verstappen closes off Pierre Gasly immediately off the line, the Ferrari on the opposite side, behind Verstappen actually, by Verstappen's lunge to protect from Gasly, Leclerc got an incredible line off the start there and immediately took second away from Pierre, but Pierre fighting back on the run up to, I forget what the corner number is because I don't know whether certain corners count as corners, but what will be the end of what is effectively the first DRS straight. Gasly takes both of them on that corner. He gets the run on Leclerc out of the little sort of double kink there, and then in the actual corner, finds Max Verstappen a little wide, giving him the racing room, and takes the inside. So Pierre Gasly, as the second highlight comes in, which is effectively the same thing. But there we go. Ahead of Max Verstappen as we head into the S's and head towards the second sector of the race. Meanwhile, Mick behind is still in 11th. Yes, that's right. Mick is still in 11th, and we have actually pushed the tyres for the first part of this lap, but we're not going to be doing that for too much longer. Obviously, for deploying full fuel as well, as is our custom now. But we can't afford to push those tyres any longer than half a lap, quite frankly. We'd already lost 5% in that 1/2 lap. But Gasly is in the lead by 8/10 at this stage. Mick Schumacher, however, is right up the chuff of Lando Norris. As we can see here, as Lando goes to defend, Mick has to basically on-attack and try and take what is the outside line going into the final corner. He is behind by what would be the DRS line, but obviously DRS for 2 more laps is not a thing. But as Gasly crosses the line to finish lap 1, he is a full second ahead of Max Verstappen, who does close a smidge in the corner. But pushing Gasly, he is finding the pace in the race to pull away from the Red Bull, seemingly. Although the gap has closed, even though there is no DRS yet, as the lap goes on. Mick Schumacher, however, is still looking in the back of Lando Norris. Jack Doohan struggling to keep on the back of Hamilton. Bottas has already lost a second on the top 5, so those marks are already going to be falling away seemingly over the course of the race. But Hamilton, of course, very much capable of hanging with his former team in his new team. At this stage of the lap, as we sort of approach the final sector here, or head through the final sector, Verstappen has closed on Gasly to about 6 or 7 tenths. So at this point in time, there's a consideration to try and use the RS to pull away from him, but ultimately we're just resigning to the fact that this is probably going to be a long race for Pierre Gasly, a long fight for Pierre Gasly, and we're not going to waste the RS now just to try and get that advantage. We're now expecting a full race-long fight with Verstappen, Leclerc, Perez, Sainz for the lead, whoever ends up sort of emerging from that group. Max certainly, of course, but on the lap that DRS is activated, Bottas has lost Sainz, they're a full 1.5 seconds behind, and Doohan has lost Hamilton, so they're a full 1.5 seconds behind as well. Unfortunately, that does mean that Mick is in a train here because Lando is within the DRS of Jack Doohan. So trying to find the move on Lando first is marginally problematic. We've popped him on overtake for the time being just to see if he can get the McLaren and then be the prime beneficiary of the DRS himself. But alas, no dice just yet, as Gasly survives the first 2 DRS zones with a Red Bull in his wings. Effectively, at this stage, with the DRS activated, we are just resigning ourselves to the fact that Verstappen will overtake and does overtake Gasly at some stage here. But we know that Gasly clearly has the pace to stick with them, as Norris has taken Doohan in the background there. There's a minor yellow as Albon goes off the track and goes to the back of the field, but that doesn't affect any of our races. So going full deploy with Mick as he takes both Norris and Doohan on the main straight, because Lando took Jack Doohan, he had none of the DRS on the main straight. And then because Mick was behind Doohan going into the second DRS zone, or the first DRS zone for the actual lap, he got the DRS on Jack Doohan out of there and pulled away from him. It was perfect gamesmanship from Mick Schumacher. Perfect gamesmanship. And obviously full deploying with Mick there, doing a new fastest lap in the process, gets him the second on Jack Doohan as well. The idea now, hopefully, is that Mick can maybe get in the DRS of Bottas, Russell, Hamilton. But we've already pushed the field beyond half a lap at this stage, and Mick does get within the DRS of that train ahead. At this point, I have legitimately forgotten to take him off fuel push. By the way here, this wasn't intentional to run them that long, particularly obviously that long with Mick in the DRS. He did like 1 or 2 laps inside of their DRS, I think, at that stage. I could have easily taken him off the fuel at that point. On lap 8, as they finish lap 8, Gasly's back in the lead of the race as that lead does sort of interchange between those front runners. Similarly, the front runner of this pack of 4 does alternate on various laps. As you can see, this fight up front. 5 cars involved, 4 of them obviously with DRS, flying in formation, just all of them trying to find an angle that none of them can find while simultaneously defending from the car behind. And ultimately, it kind of, for the most part, works in the lead car's favour, because all of them have that slight hesitancy to really go for it in case they make themselves vulnerable afterwards. But simultaneously, obviously, with Mick in the DRS train with Bottas, Russell, Hamilton, has pulled away from the Doohan Norris train, which goes all the way back to Magnussen, actually. In fact, Stroll in 16th. So there's effectively 4 trains at this point. There's the train for the first 5, then there's these 4 with Russell through to Mick, and then there's Doohan through to Stroll, and then the Vettel through to Albon once he nicks into that 1 second again, having gone to the back. But there's a VSC because something has happened to the Mercedes. We're not sure exactly what's happened at this point, but Bottas has lost a huge amount of time, and Russell has a penalty. And that's what's happened there. One Mercedes goes off the track, comes back on the track. The one that gets hit just stops on the corner for no apparent reason. So it's Russell that's gone off. He's come back, rejoined, tapped Bottas himself, and then Hamilton has driven into him. I don't think Hamilton's taken damage, but there's a pause in proceedings here as I try to work out what the best opportunity is for us. The pit window, as I flip over to both cars, obviously for both cars, is not for a little while. The pit window doesn't open for 6 laps, and we start to consider new strategies. What can the medium do? Can the hard just work until the soft again? No, it cannot. Medium, hard, medium, absolutely an option at this stage. It can just about make it. It's not the opportune tyre. You do lose 26 seconds on the overall race time, but you are effectively getting a pit stop in for free. You're getting a cheaper pit stop. It's only a VSC. It's not a full safety car, of course, here. So I just have to move out of the way and try and track my own camera movements from the original recording. But she was saving about 7 or so seconds on this pit stop here. If you pit now, and now we're just double checking, making sure what the relative gaps are to the front runners here. So Gasly obviously in the lead right now. We're just sort of circling, highlighting this sort of the Zhou position where we're kind of roughly expecting 15, 16 seconds to be under a safety car, virtual safety car. Mick has a little bit more free reign here, obviously being in 9th right now. He is in a train with Bottas and Hamilton, as I still forget to go back into the middle during this discussion, but so you can't really see what I'm doing with Mick. But the new plan emerges and doing the reverse of basically the original idea there. Going on the mediums now, if you pit Mick, he will end up at the back of the grid in some relative amount of clean air. So putting him on a faster tyre at this stage could work. But can you just about squeak a medium-medium? We do have 2 brand new fresh sets of medium tyres. Can that actually work? Mick's obviously good on his tyres, as the strategy doesn't actually save there, but you're going to get a lap of easy running under the VSC to begin with. Ultimately, we decide the medium hard is barely on it to begin with, but we do pit Mick. We do pit Mick, but we don't pit Pierre Gasly, who's obviously fighting for the lead, and if he does pit right now, he'll end up in the mid pack there. And then not pitting Pierre, everyone behind him pits, including both Red Bulls and ultimately both Ferraris as well. Which is an interesting decision from the AI. Because the AI don't even normally double stack during rain. You know, when there's a direct benefit of being on the correct tyre. They don't even double stack during those situations normally and end up suffering one of their cars about 20 seconds on the wrong tyres, as literally everyone, in fact, then pits in the top 11 at least. Thereby negating the idea with Mick to begin with, as I finally remember to go back in the middle. So there's a certain amount of confusion at this point as to what on earth is everyone doing. As effectively the front half of the grid pit and the back half don't. Russell, of course, has the penalty on top of his double stacking as well. So the only conclusion I could make here is the fact that some of the drivers, at least the front half, have decided that they were within their window of opportunity for pitting on their 2-stop strategies, and they all go on hards. What this does mean, though, is Mick does still stay within range of Bottas, in particular. He's still ahead of Norris, although they have closed because obviously the crash, but Mick's on mediums at this point because he's going medium to hard. So Mick is an outlier here. There's half the field still on their original softs, half the field have gone onto their hards already, and then there's Mick just on mediums. But that, in theory, does make him on a better tyre than Bottas in this stage of the race. He's got to refine the DRS, because the pit stop popped him 1.3 seconds behind, but as the VSC ends as well at this stage, as Gasly's basically by himself at the front of the grid now, with nobody hounding him, just free to drive around on those softs. Ocon is 14 seconds behind him. Obviously, he doesn't have a free pit stop, but most importantly, Verstappen is behind Williams, Vettel, Stroll, Magnussen, Ricciardo. Ocon is dictating the pace of the other front runners at this point in time because they are all in a train with each other through to Leclerc in 12th. It goes from Ocon all the way to Leclerc in 12th. Perez is a couple of seconds behind, Sainz is behind him, and then Bottas is several seconds behind him. Mick immediately gets within the DRS range of Bottas, which is good, but Gasly's soft tyres aren't that much better than Zhou's and Ocon's pace overall. Like, the gap to Ocon isn't really improving that much, but Verstappen is still stuck in that train. There's not a lot he can do. Mick and Bottas have begun an interchange of just swapping over on a regular basis. So what we're really effectively hoping for here is that the time that Verstappen has lost in that train is the effective equivalent of the time that he saved by pitting under a VSC, and now he's on much worse tyres than Pierre will be when Pierre pits. Same with Leclerc, same with Sainz, same with Perez. Now, looking at the overall to leader, there's a good chance that realistically he still comes out behind Perez here, but simultaneously still on worse tyres. Or better tyres than them, I should say. Mick still has the fastest lap at this stage of the race. From that lap, he just decided to, I pushed him to pull away from the 2 cars stuck behind him, as Vettel pits as well. So cars have started to peel out of this train now, and it is Pierre's time to actually pit. So due to a few cars pitting, Verstappen does have a bit of clean air ahead of him. Gasly is still driving his tyres ahead of schedule as well, which is quite nice. So Gasly goes round this final lap into the pits, as some of those front runners obviously get past him, but he rejoins directly behind Perez, which is what we effectively wanted at this stage. We knew he wasn't going to get back ahead of Verstappen here. Verstappen is on hard tyres behind very old Ocon and Stroll soft tyres. Meanwhile, Gasly's at the back of this train with Sainz, Leclerc and Perez on brand new mediums, on overtake as well. And he's got an interesting line on Perez towards this penultimate straight. In fact, he does get Perez basically straight away there. So we just pop things on neutral again for this straight. because the two Ferraris are squabbling between each other. Meanwhile, in the background, I believe Tsunoda's sort of just slowed his way into Bottas and Mick, so that's why there's a gap between Bottas and Mick on the road, at least. Tsunoda, I'm not sure if he pits here or not. He doesn't, in fact. But Tsunoda's just sort of like a weird roadblock right now for Mick. But Ocon and Stroll do finally pit, and that does release Max Verstappen, of course, into the lead here once again. So Gasly's down to 4th. Our decision under the VSC not to pit seemingly hindering him at this stage. Now, he's already got one of this front four, though, as we notice that Mick is stuck behind Tsunoda, who's sort of sandwiched between Bottas and Mick now, and we decide to actively overtake Tsunoda just so we don't lose Bottas, because Tsunoda on those old tyres is very much at risk of doing that, and Mick does get Tsunoda straight away, which is great news. And unfortunately, he's 1.1 behind Bottas, so we just have to make sure he tries and sneaks back in by the time we get to a DRS line, and seemingly Mick's managed to do so. So the good news is the Mick and Bottas fight does continue on, as Gasly puts himself between the two Ferraris in an incredibly dangerous and bold move there. It's a superb move from Pierre Gasly. He only gets one of them, but that could have gone wrong so many different ways. But Gasly's ahead of Sainz now as well, as he has just the DRS. And I will actually get out of the way of this particular highlight. Just in case you're wondering, by the way, I will reveal it now. The only reason why I get out of the way for highlights is so I can take screenshots for thumbnails. But I will let you see this one in all its majesty, and it doesn't really show it at the best angle anyway, so kind of irrelevant. So with only Leclerc ahead on this main straight, Pierre Gasly just powers past him with DRS, takes the right hand. Of course, he has to defend from Leclerc again now because there's a separate DRS line here. I'm not really sure why this one isn't double DRS, but it does make for exciting back and forths. But of course, the hope here is now that on slightly better mediums to their hards, Gasly can make up the 1.5 seconds he needs to get inside Verstappen's DRS as well. But actually, you can see here, the double stacking of Sainz and Perez doesn't actually seem to have harmed them too badly. They're all still in the train with each other. That hasn't seemed to have harmed them. But obviously, Russell, A, being double stacked and B, having the penalty, as Mick gets Bottas once again. Russell's down in 16th. It's not good for him. Tsunoda's still yet to pit, of course, and does so there. So that puts Hamilton back in the top 10. But Hamilton, seemingly through those pit stops, has been unlucky to a degree. I don't know whether he did take wing damage or not and then had to change his wing in those pit stops, and that's what's put him behind Doohan and Norris. In fact, that's something I've only just noticed on this rewatch here, because of course he was running with Bottas, Mick and Russell when the incident happened, because he tapped Russell when Russell came back onto the racing line. So Gasly now at the front of this train does the fastest lap, but Verstappen immediately re-overtakes him, but will be behind again for this DRS straight, so we could have a bit of a Verstappen-Leclerc with Gasly here. As with DRS, Gasly moves to the inside and doesn't really make a move. Realistically, at this stage, we're happy to be sort of basically back at status quo. And in fact, at this stage of the race, about just under halfway in this race, we are almost effectively exactly where we were when the VSC happened. Gasly's fighting for the lead, mixed with Bottas here. The only change that's happened realistically is the fact that Russell, the one to have caused the VSC in the first place, has dropped out of this fight with Bottas, as has Hamilton, who similarly seemingly has suffered through the VSC phase as well. So all that's happened is people have dropped out of the fight for 6th. Everything else is pretty much as it was. Obviously, the order further down has rearranged itself a little bit, but in terms of our fights, we're exactly where we are. Gasly's fighting for P1, Mick's fighting for P6. But we're on medium tyres and they're on hard tyres at this stage of the race. So we're on very different strategies at this point in time. But meanwhile, Ocon, who's moved on to medium tyres in the background as well, after his pit stops, has moved back up to 8th, overtaking some of the hard runners who pitted under the VSC. But he's having a decent race now. He's benefited from the VSC by actually not pitting as well. It's interesting. Mick effectively just hasn't lost out during the VSC by doing what everyone else does. And Gasly seemingly also hasn't lost out either, because he's on a better tyre at this point in time. And those front runners now effectively have a full pit stop over Ocon. But Ocon's pulled away from those others on the hards in the background, on his mediums. As Tsunoda goes for another wander. I don't know what's wrong with Tsunoda in F1 Manager 22, but he's very accident prone. It's like they've seen the accident proneness of Tsunoda in real life and just turned the dial up to 11. Like, sure, he's very much capable of making a rash decision in a race, but the frequency in which Tsunoda goes off the track here is remarkable. So at this point in the race, as we just cross over halfway, we reassess the situations in regards to strategy and realise at least Mick is doing a very good job of his tyres. He's on 44% still, and considering our original strategy was to run them down to 30%, which is the danger line for the actual game, there's an opportunity for Mick Schumacher to go medium-medium, because of course he pitted when the VSC happened and Pierre didn't. So Pierre's still on course to do the original strategy, but Mick, having pitted earlier, his tyres are about 20% worse than Pierre's. but Mick can do medium. Mick's still in a fight with Bottas, 16 seconds off the lead. Ocon's not too far behind now. So Bottas and Mick are sort of slowly falling back into Ocon at this stage of the race, where Ocon's on mediums that aren't too dissimilar to Gasly's mediums, whereas both Mick and Bottas' tyres are getting close to the sort of falling off stage phase. Leclerc and Sainz and Perez have also dropped off the lead race as well. It's just Gasly and Verstappen now. There's 6 seconds back to the Ferraris and Perez. I don't really know what facilitated that, but I didn't notice in the original recording, and I don't really know now either exactly what happened with Leclerc, Sainz and Perez. I'm guessing it's just a gradual slowdown. Just double checking what the consideration is for a pit stop here. Green flag 23 seconds. Apparently safety car is only 3 seconds less, which seems ridiculous. But if Mick was to pit right now, he is going to end up in a big old train of cars, but at the same time his tyres are on 40%. So that's effectively the consideration we're making right now. We're trying to work out how far down Mick will fall if he's to pit right now. And 23 seconds would put him behind Vettel. Ahead of Tsunoda, but behind Vettel in 19th. And of course, that bottom half of the grid all pitted at a different time to Mick. So at this point, we're effectively concerned that we're about to get stuck in the same situation that Verstappen was stuck in when he pitted at the beginning, onto the VSC to begin with. But we also know that Bottas has got to stop again, no matter what. And we're pretty certain that everyone still has to pit again, no matter what as well. Because those that pitted onto the VSC have pitted earlier than scheduled, and every single original strategy had 2 stops anyway. So anyone who stuck to their original strategy, presumably still on a 2-stop. Anyone who pitted earlier, still obviously on a 2-stop. So everyone still has to pit again. Whilst we're making these considerations for pitting, just doing a bit of harvesting with Mick. Just try and get a bit of ERS back into his system so that we can deploy it later on, hopefully. And even though Mick is harvesting at this stage of the race, decides to get past Bottas anyway. But it is interesting that a harvesting Mick Schumacher can still overtake Bottas with DRS, as there is a yellow flag briefly on track as Tsunoda spins yet again. See what I mean though? Tsunoda's accident proneness in this game is utterly off the charts, particularly in that Williams. Like, he was accident prone in the AlphaTauri before he went to Williams, but in the Williams, he just goes off at any given moment as Bottas re-overtakes, obviously, in his DRS. But we know that we have effectively the net advantage over Norris at this point, who's the one leading the pace for the train that goes all the way to Vettel. So we're basically just trying to run Schumacher as long as possible to try and build up that gap so he doesn't fall as far through that order as possible. As we flip back to just watching Gasly and Verstappen, Ocon is right on the borderline for Gasly's pit stop as things stand, and on similar tyres, so we're not really going to get much of a benefit there. We're not expecting Ocon to pit before us, as a Haas goes off the track in the form of Vettel, which, you know, opens up another bit of a gap there, but we're still going to get stuck in that train regardless if Mick pits. But Mick's on to 36% tyres now, and there's really not any further we can push him at this stage of the race. Those tyres, the cliff is imminent. But we decided to utilise Bottas's DRS for 1 more lap with Mick, effectively giving him 1 more lap's worth of tyre on the mediums that he's pitting onto, also harvesting a bit of ERS in the process behind Bottas, using a Merc whose tyres are close to the cliff themselves but not off it yet. So in theory, that Merc should be relatively okay on pace at this point in time, and definitely faster than doing a Norris, we would expect, because they're on the same tyres as them, but in a faster car. Ocon has closed up at this phase. He's getting quite close to being within DRS range of the pair of us now, but in fact, we actually go for it for another lap with Mick just to keep things going as long as physically possible. At this stage, we're also, having seen Leclerc just pit out of that top 5, we're kind of hoping that some more people pit, because Norris pits as well there. So we're just kind of effectively hoping that some of the people who pitted under the safety car pit again now. Unfortunately, only Norris and Leclerc did on that 1 lap. So that doesn't benefit Mick, but we literally cannot go any further with Mick on these tyres. He's at 30%. We've already pushed him beyond his original pit lap. So in he comes for this second set of mediums, which will have more than enough to get him to the end of the race now because we've taken more out of these ones. Like, they had just enough to get to the end, but now we've taken an extra 2 laps off them. Seeing Perez pit as well on this lap, we're hoping more of that train of cars behind decide to pit. We're kind of hoping Bottas does as well, but he doesn't. But this actually could be good for us if Bottas doesn't, depending on where we pop out. If we were to get any sense of free air here, unfortunately, nobody in that train behind does pit. Russell does, but Doohan doesn't. So Mick, on brand new mediums, ends up, thankfully, ahead of Sargent. So it's one of the cars we don't have to deal with there. He ends up ahead of one of them, but unfortunately, he is stuck very much in this train. So in order to get something on Bottas here, he very much needs to negotiate this train as quickly as possible. Russell obviously pitting again takes him to the back of the grid again, well behind Norris as Gasly and Verstappen continue to fight. But Sainz is a full 10 seconds behind the leaders now, and Ocon and Bottas are about to pit stop behind Gasly. Ocon and Bottas obviously fighting each other as well here, as Ocon goes off the track. We were really hoping that Ocon and Bottas fighting each other would help them, you know, deal with each other, help them slow each other down a little bit, make the undercut for Mick work a little bit better. But unfortunately, Ocon took things into his own hands and drove off the track. Basically, undid all his good work. But he's still comfortably ahead of his teammate Hamilton at this stage, back on track. With Mick, we're just having to do a bit of selective overtaking as now Gasly's getting close to his pit stop. We're just going to use Verstappen as a DRS harvesting point. Even though we're harvesting ERS, with DRS, he overtakes Verstappen anyway. So we take him off it just so he can defend. But yeah, Mick in this train, we're just going to do a bit of selective harvesting and overtaking. Hamilton now pits, which is obviously one less car for Mick to have to overtake in total. But just sort of seeing how this train sort of organises itself to a degree and what our relative pace is whilst harvesting. But there's 6 cars here that Mick absolutely needs to overtake. Dua's on 32% hard, so we're expecting him to drop out of it eventually and pit again, but soon. But those other runners might not pit immediately. With a reasonable amount of overtake available to him now, we're just going to set Mick onto overtake mode in the DRS zone here. Verstappen's tyres are now on 35%, so those hard tyres going off a little bit now for them. Bottas still hasn't pitted. Albon's tyres just dipped under 40% as well, so Mick's just having a little look at Albon. Doesn't quite get him there. He's got a little bit of fuel to work with as well, so just going to push the fuel and the overtake. A little bit of a dummy there from Mick Schumacher, forces Albon to defend the inside and just zooms past him on the outside. Obviously not pushing the tyres themselves because they don't have any wiggle room. But again, popping the fuel is Zhou pits, in fact, not even doing the one with the tyres that are going off. Fortunately, we did use all of the ERS trying to get past Albon, but Lance Stroll makes a baffling line into the first corner, which put him all out of shape on the outbound of it. But somehow he manages to get the drive. But Mick continues to push himself on the outside, but unfortunately Danny Rick defends the inside, which makes things a little bit awkward for Mick. But Mick persists, stays on Lance's outside and becomes the inside, and eventually Lance yields. Eventually, there we go. I knew he yielded eventually. I just didn't know precisely where. That went on a few more corners than I thought it did. But with whatever remaining ERS we have, we just try and deploy him in the DRS zone. There goes Danny Rick. And in fact, Mick gets all of them in this one section. All of them. Daniel Ricciardo, Doohan and Magnussen all taken within 3 corners. Effectively, Lance Stroll as well within 4 corners as Bottas finally pits off his tyres. But unfortunately, he pits just as Mick gets clear. And unfortunately, the replay doesn't show you all of them as well. It just shows you the Magnussen overtake, not the full roster of him overtaking 3 people in the span of 3 corners. But we're just going to push his fuel whilst Bottas is in the pit in the vain hope that just pushing the fuel on this one straight gives him an extra couple of miles an hour or whatever. And Mick does clear Bottas on pit exit as he actually comes out behind Daniel Ricciardo, Lance Stroll and Albon. And yeah, I don't really know what's happened here. It triggers a red flag is what happens here. I genuinely do not know what happened. My only assumption is in trying to avoid the cars on track when he was on pit exit, Bottas just drove off the road and then caused a roadblock. Both he and Bottas, interestingly, have gone on to old hards. I don't know if Jack Doohan actually went on to old hards because he pitted a couple of laps earlier, I think. Or maybe he did pit on the same lap, but they both went on to old used hards. Keep an eye on their percentages here because the red flag comes out, they're on 83 and 84% as things stand. What this does mean is we have a decision to make with Pierre Gasly because the red flag's come out. It's a free pit stop for Pierre, and his 38% mediums have 12 laps of lifetime left. That's basically the marker point we're looking at for the mediums here. So basically, a fresh set of mediums here are good for 21 laps, and I believe there's 16 remaining. If 38% is 12 laps, then they're good for effectively 21 laps. Maybe 22, obviously pushing them to 30%. He's already done soft to medium, so it doesn't matter what he goes on to here. Meanwhile, a set of used softs you just saw there is good for 8 laps remaining. So the effective usage of the soft tyres is about 12 laps off the one set of used softs he's still got remaining up there in the top left. Hopefully I re-hover over that again. I can't remember if I do, but yeah, so you can see that they have an effective lifetime of 20 laps, but we saw there that 37% is 8, so they're only good for 12, and there's 16 laps remaining. So the decision becomes a bit of a no-brainer at this point in time. We've got 16 laps to do, and we've got a free pit stop. We need to be able to do 16 laps. The softs are not capable. Mediums are the only way to go here. As for Mick, he's already on these mediums. And he's got a set of softs that's good for 21 laps, apparently, but we know they're only good for 13, effectively, that set. So, similarly, he has to stay on the mediums he's already on, because they need to be able to do 16 laps. And you can see that the mediums on right now are good for 29 remaining, and we know they go down to, we know their lifetime usage, the point where they actually get unusable is 12 laps remaining. So he's got 17 laps remaining on these mediums, effectively, and we need him to do 16. So he's still on the borderline, can't push him too much, and there's actually the ultimate amount of remaining as well, because he pushed those to 31%. So the ultimate amount of remaining is 19 laps, but 17 of good usage. And then 2 of, he'll just have to survive, basically. But we only need him to do 16, so he's okay there. So it's a full race restart as well. So it's lights out and away we go once again. There's no opportunity to do these in the off thing. We somehow regain a ton of fuel during that period, even though technically there's no race distance lost. Although things do resume on lap 42, actually, so maybe that's what's happened there. And just have a quick look at Bottas and Doohan's tyre percentages now. Bear in mind they've not driven anywhere since the red flag came out. They have somehow lost 12% on their softs. Jack Doohan somehow lost 14% on his. Jack Doohan lost more off his softs than Bottas did somehow, as I noticed it in real time. They're not going to get to the end. None of the people who have gone on softs, by the way, are going to get to the end of the race. Everyone else goes on to softs. They will not get to the end of the race, or at least get to the end of the race with any sense of usability. Bottas and Doohan, who lost 15% off theirs, or, 12 to 15%, absolutely will not get to the end of the race. They'll barely get to lap 50. So at this point, even though we're pushing Mick, obviously we can't really do it for too much longer. He's got about 1 extra laps we can kind of burn off his tyres if necessary, which we are doing. And the fuel we can burn effectively for the remainder of this race. But Gasly takes the lead off the start, and Sainz actually gets Verstappen off the restart. Obviously the gap that was back to Sainz and Leclerc and Perez evaporated, thanks to the red flag. So they're back in touching distance. Gasly's got a little bit more wiggle room just to burn through his tyres, but I believe we pull him back off of his tyres almost straight away now. There we go, yeah. Just to give him that extra advantage when they do pit stop as well. We want to keep his tyres into a relative amount of capability here. Especially with Sainz being the one directly behind Verstappen and no DRS for another lap or so. We're in a really good position here. We've got tyres that will definitely get to the end of the race with a certain amount of competency. Mick, however, is struggling to keep in touch with Ocon, seemingly. But actually, I think I was being lied to there, which is why briefly I tipped Mick up onto aggressive. There seems to be a portion of the track where Mick struggles in comparison to Ocon, who is technically just in the DRS of actually the leaders here. So we just try and make sure we get Mick into the train as Magnussen goes off the track and ends at the back of the grid again. But the lead does change hands several times here. Sainz now leading. Pierre down to third as things stand. But of course, Bottas having pitted basically immediately before the red flag and then causing the red flag means Bottas is out of that fight. Mick is on similar level medium tyres to everyone else's soft tyres, which is why his relative pace right now is a little bit worse than theirs. But their tyres are going to go off faster than his. And actually, Mick ends up falling into the fight with Ricciardo rather than Ocon. But with every lap that goes by, their soft tyres are getting worse and worse, and their relative pace are getting worse and worse compared to the medium of Mick and, most importantly, Gasly. Whatever tyre advantage they had at the restart with 1 qualifying round worth of used soft tyres, even 84% softs are faster than 100% mediums. But with every lap that goes by, those softs get worse and worse and worse. Whereas our mediums hold on and hold on and hold on. So Mick works his way back to the front of the queue that he's in. Albon proves in an irritating fight. But this becomes a case of Mick's tyres just have to hold on and hope that these soft ones die on them. And he just ends up, even though he's on mediums, he ends up with better pace than them, particularly Ocon. Because the gap to Ocon's growing. Ocon's keeping in touch with the front 5, which is annoying. But there goes Bottas, pitting on lap 53 again because his has gone completely off. Jack Doohan, you can see, is on 23% and just falling down the order. But Russell's in 15th, he's stuck down there. Hamilton's in 13th, he's stuck down there. Norris is in 12th. Bottas is now at the back of the grid. So the Mercedes right now scoring nothing. And Mercedes are effectively our rival for this season. We're aiming for third. We know the Ferraris and the Red Bulls are faster, and Perez pits inexplicably with 3 laps to go. You'd think those people who started on 84% will just try and ride their luck to the end. Jack Doohan still hasn't pitted and he's on 20%. But Russell pits as well, weirdly. So the Mercedes running 19th and 20th now, as Mick gets Albon once again. So Mick's medium tyres, not that much better than their softs, weirdly. Despite the fact that Mick has 88 smoothness, his medium tyres are going off only marginally slower than their softs. But Hamilton, Norris and Doohan all pit now and drop down the order, which promotes Sargent into 10th. Sargent on debut, do not forget here. And with 3 laps to go, Gasly's re-inherited the lead. Mick and Albon, though, irritatingly, still 6th and 7th. And seemingly no closer to actually getting closer to Ocon. At this point, I think I've noticed that Mick's tyres are on 40%. He just cannot. We cannot risk it. We cannot really push him any more than necessary. We try and get him ahead of Albon at this stage, just to see if he can actually close in on Ocon on these final few laps. Still pushing fuel. We've sort of accepted that whilst the softs have a relative level of functionality, Mick's incapable of actually pulling away from Ocon due to the 3 DRS zones. Albon, sorry. We're hoping now that Albon's tyres have gone off to the point where that even with DRS, he will stop fighting Mick. Unfortunately, Verstappen gets Gasly again. But their tyres are now dipped under 30%. Verstappen, Sainz, Leclerc, Ocon. All their tyres are under 30%. Albon and Ricciardo also under 30% as well. You know, all drivers that got into the top 10 and had no more free sets. People like Sargent, Tsunoda, Vettel, Magnussen, who did still have a new set of softs, were fine here effectively to run to the end. Just about. But those front runners, their pace should be gone. Albon is on 28% softs at this stage. He should have 0 pace at all. Whereas apparently 30%, 36% mediums should be still okay because apparently the cutoff is 30%. At least that's the bar that's given to you on the graphs in F1 Manager. That's where the line is. So at this point, Mick should be unchallenged by Albon. But of course, Perez pitting has promoted Mick up to 6th at this stage. But with the final lap begun, we've angled it so Gasly has overtaken Verstappen in the first DRS zone and now has enough of a lap of ERS, full push some fuel. We saved a bit of fuel. We were about to run out at one stage, so we held on to that advantage on the fuel. We can now push the tyres as well. We can push the ERS. We can push the fuel. Gasly's in the lead on the final lap. Albon's fighting Mick again, irritatingly. Even though his tyres should be utterly useless at this point, somehow he's found the grip. But there's one more DRS zone for Mick to just sort of wait behind Albon on. And he's got enough medium tyres to actually attack without going underneath 30% as well. So full deploy, full fuel push, full tyre attack. Should be a doddle with DRS. And of course there's no more DRS till the line now. So in theory, that's Mick ahead of Albon at the end. No issues there. And with full utter push on everything, Gasly opened up 1.5 seconds of Verstappen on that final lap, having overtaken him. Full ERS push, full fuel push, fuel tyre push, takes the checkered flag in P1. First race, that's a win. Gasly doesn't know how he did that, apparently. To be fair, I don't really know how he did it either. Bizarre circumstances, but the weirdest red flag I've ever seen. Sargent crosses the line in 10th ahead of his teammate to get his debut point. Tsunoda gets 11th, as he does in real life. Sargent joining the ranks that includes Tsunoda and Zhou Guanyu, who are behind him on the road, of getting a point on debut. Poor Jack Doohan ends up 20th or 20. His luck is still appalling. But Albon gets 7th, Ricciardo gets 8th, Stroll gets 9th, and Sargent gets 10th because of all those high-profile pittings at the end. A huge amount of opportunity was granted to some of the people in weaker teams as Gasly celebrates his win with about a dozen Aston Martin engineers. I don't know where the rest of them are. Dear F1 Manager 22, put more people there, please. Well, 23, I should say. But Pierre Gasly on the top step in the first race of the new season. Now, as exciting as this is, we need to just meter our expectations here. This was a race that we managed to manage and keep Pierre in the lead. We know from qualifying that Max Verstappen is the fastest, but it does seem that Pierre Gasly, at least, is capable of mixing it with the big boys. Obviously, Mick is that little bit weaker as a driver. As much as I love Mick, I'm not going to pretend he isn't weaker. But Mick managed to salvage a 6th, which is okay. There we are, the full race results. Pierre Gasly first, Mick 6th. Bear in mind that Mick started 11th, let's not forget, actually, as well. So it's not a bad result from him, all things considered. But Ocon jumps 8 places to 5th overall. His pace at the end there was baffling. But Lewis Hamilton got the fastest lap, even though he wasn't in the top 10. So no bonus point there. A bonus point for obviously Max's pole, though. In second, he gets 19 points. And there's me just noticing that Logan Sargent got his point on debut as well. So shout out to Logan Sargent there. And the losers, of course, Jack Doohan, Lewis Hamilton in particular, and Valtteri Bottas all pitted after the red flag and very much ruined all their chances. And the worst thing is, I could have done the race day bonus of actually both drivers gaining a place because Pierre got the place. But obviously after race 1, Pierre Gasly tops the standings because it's the only standings. Lewis Hamilton 19th after race 1. Good start. And constructors-wise, boy is it funny to see only 2 teams without points. Ferrari actually second, despite Max being, second in the race. Ferrari only second because Sergio got no points. Alpine only got points under Ocon, so they're 4th right now, and everyone else is basically as is because one driver each. But yeah, no points for Haas, and Mercedes, no points for them either. They are 10th of 10 after race 1. Pierre gets a development point after winning that race. Mick gets 1,400 points for his race as well, which isn't too shabby, and Behrman gaining points like a madman, but I don't think he gets one here. As our charge continues to get Pierre 100 out of 100 braking. But obviously the board very much loved the victory there. The board's confidence goes up immensely as per the text. But yeah, that's race 1 of the season completed. It'd be lovely to think this is what we're doing for the rest of the season, but there's a part of me that feels like we just need to meet our expectations just a little bit. We know we don't have the fastest car, but we do have a fantastic driver in Pierre Gasly, and Mick not too far behind. It was a competent race from Mick. He was fighting with the Mercedes very well, so we know he's got enough pace to fight and get points regularly, it seems, this season at least, which is the minimum that we want from him, quite frankly, as he continues to develop. But yes, it's an exciting start. If you enjoyed this, like, comment, subscribe. Races back to normal, live commentary, of course, from here on in. Join me for Jeddah next time out. Thank you for joining me. Ta-ra.